This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Warm welcome from me too. My name is Mattia Gallotti. I'm a research fellow in philosophy here in the School of Advanced Study and the manager of the Humanities project. I think Colin has already covered some of the practical things that you'd like to know. We have a team of colleagues from the school who volunteered to help today, and I'd like to, well, first of all, to thank them for their work and to ask them if they can please stand up and make themselves visible. Matt, Aaron, and Joe, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. They will be around all day, or myself, of course, will be around all day here. Now, as Colin mentioned, the idea is to we'll have 3 sessions, 1 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Speakers will talk for about 25-30 minutes. We will break for a couple of minutes. You can refill your cups, but the idea is not to take questions unless they are burning clarificatory questions, because we really would like to encourage something like an interdisciplinary Q&A where the speakers can take questions and address them jointly, and it's entirely up to them how to address your questions in the final 30 minutes of each session. Now, I think we are ready to start, so it is a great pleasure for me to introduce the first 2 speakers of the day, Professor Sarah Churchwell and Dr. Thomas Scott Phillips. Now, Professor Sarah Churchwell is the chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities and a professor fellow in American Literature here in the School of Advanced Study. She joined the school very recently, I believe in early October, and she's leading the public engagement activity of the school. She regularly comments on art, culture, and politics. Her pieces appear in the New Yorker, the Guardian, the New York Times. She's a very public figure in contemporary cultural discourse. She's writing a book on Henry James, I understand.
Good morning. I feel slightly bemused at the idea that I'm being asked to go first on this day of very interesting talks, as I'm not a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, a biologist, or a linguist. And some of you may have noticed that I was late submitting both a title and an abstract. In fact, I never submitted an abstract. This is not entirely due to my chronic state of being oversubscribed, although I have something to do with that. But it mostly related to the fact that I am very well aware that this symposium is asking me to step far outside of my comfort zone and talk about areas I'm not expert in, although I am interested in them. So, and I know Mattia said to me, he just wanted me to talk a little bit about stories and what I understand about their relationship to human thought. And I realized as I was trying to set some of those out that they were sounding even to my own ears hopelessly self-evident. And I didn't want to waste my own time, let alone all of yours, by burbling superficially about the importance of stories to human history. I'm sure we can all take that as read. I struggled for some time to arrive at a topic that I thought would be relevant to the day's discussion, that I might have any hope of offering interesting reflections on, much less kicking things off in a field so far away from where I usually try to pull a few weeds. Part of the problem is that the boundaries of my own field have long been something I couldn't quite see with any clarity anyway. And indeed, to many observers, my work seemed all over the map, as I know from various interviews and bios and things that would have said to me, what the hell are you talking about? But I could feel instinctively that there were concepts that formed boundaries. They weren't obvious to me or to these people challenging me. So, if you'll bear with me, I thought I'd say a little something about that work as a way of mapping a few inchoate thoughts about language and the mind. I'll have less to say about literacy, as they've, although I'm incredibly interested in literacy, as I hope will be obvious. But as these inchoate thoughts have affected my thinking and research, and you'll see that stories are absolutely central to what I do, and the transmission of stories is central to what I do. So maybe it's telling that I couldn't quite find a way to articulate ideas that seemed provocative to me, anyway. My first piece of sustained literary research, if you could call it that, was my senior thesis as an undergraduate. And I was drawing on Vladimir Prop's structuralist analysis of the morphology of fairy tales, and I proposed a morphography, a kind of structuralist historiography, of the variations in 3 classic tales of the persecuted heroine, Cinderella, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty, moving in time from the 16th century Neapolitan Giambattista Basile, who has some absolutely amazing versions of those stories that most people don't know, through the more familiar versions of Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, and ending on Disney. I loved doing it at the time, although I had absolutely no idea why or what I was groping toward, or the ways that the piece was compromised by an uncritical post-feminism, but I'm still in many ways proud of it. Where I did my postgraduate degree at Princeton, we didn't write MA theses, we took exams, so the next big piece of research I did was really my PhD. And that looked at the posthumous biographical construction of famous dead women, Marilyn Monroe, Sylvia Plath, and Janis Joplin, tracing their evolution across the rise of second wave feminism, which is when I figured out that I was an uncritical post-feminist and I'd never become critical of that.
Susan, could you go a bit?
I could try. The book that came out of that thesis was called The Many Lives of Marilyn Monroe, and it was about the evolving biographical construction of Monroe. It probably at this point sounds obvious what the similarities between those 2 pieces of research were, but I can only assure you that at the time it was entirely unclear to me. And then, sometime later, I wrote a book about the Great Gatsby, and everybody said, how did you get from iconic dead women to the Great Gatsby? The Gatsby book is the most recent one that I've done, and it's truer to my current intellectual interests than anything else I've written. And it consolidates a lot of scholarly and pedagogical work I've done centered on American prose in the first half of the 20th century, which is where I think my work will sit for a while. The book on Gatsby is about the historical context of 1922, which is the year in which Fitzgerald imagined the novel and in which he set it. And it was only in writing this book that I finally realized what binds all of these apparently disparate pieces of research. And even in the ways that I've set them out here, I think I've positioned them with more clarity than they had as they were emerging in my mind. But I'm interested in how context determines meaning. That's what it boils down to. And I'm particularly interested in the way that comparative contexts change the meanings of apparently static texts or icons. It seems to me that contexts make texts dynamic, and they make them less literal. But I'm also interested, as this catalog of research should suggest, in transmission. At some point laterally, in fact it was reading Thomas Pynchon that made me realize that I probably should have gone into communications theory, as interested as I am in information and noise. But then when I tried to read communications theory, I found it totally unintelligible. So I let Pynchon be the only source I was going to get of communications theory, so I don't know anything about it at all. My current project, which is called Mastery, takes these interests in creative criticism, intertextuality, comparative context, and biographical criticism further in the direction of narrative and figurative writing, rather than just narrative and figurative reading. And it's an exploration of figuration and literalism in Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. In 1895, which is the year in which Henry James was told the story that would provide the foundation for The Turn of the Screw, he got it from an anecdote told to him by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in his notebooks, and so there's transmission there as well, right? But he hears this story and he turns it into this novel. He said in his notebooks, it was in his letters, I see ghosts everywhere. And that was when he began thinking about The Turn of the Screw, which of course is his most famous ghost story and most enduringly popular work. Ever since, readers of The Turn of the Screw have also seen ghosts everywhere, arguing over whether the ghosts in the story are real, the delusions of a mad narrator, or the hauntings of Henry James's own desires and fears. The Turn of the Screw is one of the Anglo-American canon's most symptomatic texts. And as some of you may know, there has been a recent debate over the last 7 to 8 years in literary scholarship, particularly in America, over the move beyond so-called symptomatic reading. As you probably know, symptomatic reading is a mode championed by Althusser following Lacan and Freud, in which literature is read as a symptom that more or less helplessly reveals various ideological problems, either of the authors or of societies, or more often of the tension between the two. For Althusser, symptomatic reading focuses on the text's underlying presumptions, the lacunae and repressions created by ideological value sets. Reading, in this reading, becomes a symptom of cognitive dissonance, of the mind's inability to reconcile ideological illusions with the presumed truth that the text can, even against the author's will, betray. A struggle for agency ensues among ideology, story, and author, in which the master reader, as critic, triumphantly exposes the suppressed truths that the text helplessly reveals, the secret that it can't successfully conceal. Paul Ricoeur calls this the hermeneutics of suspicion, a position usefully summed up by Rita Felsky as, quote, the conviction that the most rigorous reading is one that is performed against the grain, that the primary rationale for reading a text is to critique it by underscoring what it does not know and cannot understand. The text in all of these kinds of readings is thus said to have an unconscious, a repressed but discernible subtext that is present in, yet absent from, any particular segment or utterance that the text itself makes, so that only a symptomatic reading can construct it, or, as they would say, reconstruct it. But of course, textual unconsciousness is itself a metaphor. And surely we might think it's a particularly clumsy displacement. The only unconscious that makes any sense here to posit is that of the author or the given reader. Texts don't have conscious minds, you'll be glad I'm aware of that. So how can they have unconscious minds? And yet, anyone who spends their lives reading imaginative, figurative texts will tell you that the experience of reading such books leads one increasingly toward positing some such notion of textual agency, of the logic of the story or the logic of language, which spins out of the control of the conscious mind of either author or reader. Now, this may sound like I'm heading in a Derridian direction, and I'm not going to go there, although I will mention Derrida in passing in a minute. But because what Derrida does is he takes that supposition to its most radical extreme and says that textuality is completely divorced from any notion of authorial intent or meaning, and that that's just a phantasmatic desire on the part of the reader. So he takes this absolute radical stance of pure textuality, that only the text has any kind of movement, and he would resist any claim even to meaning. And following him, there are critics who talk about this as, would describe me certainly as a meaning monger, those people who are helplessly searching for meaning. I do think there's meaning. If that makes me reactionary, I can live with that. But what I'm trying to suggest is that not just that the meaning is beyond the control of the reader or the author, but that it adheres somewhere other than where we keep looking for it, and that we're possibly using the wrong metaphors to try to find it, and that maybe we have to find it through metaphor, and that in itself is part of the problem. This notion is cognate with such commonplace metaphors as that a writer's characters took over the story, although such a formulation might simply be the way the writer experiences his or her unconscious thoughts driving the tale. As Iris Murdoch once rightly observed, it seems to me, systematic patterns are not actually evidence of conscious intention. As she wrote, instinct can produce systems. And there is often a sense in many books of patterns that emerge beyond the intention of the author. Such a sense can sometimes be substantiated by epitextual evidence, such as correspondence or journals, in which the author reveals an intention that it can be argued is at odds with the finished work. But of course, systems of meanings in books or stories are not always consistent or controlled, but that doesn't mean that they're not discernible. And they're not only in the mind of an individual reader. Again, that kind of radical claim to subjectivity seems to me untenable, because once it's pointed out, then other people see it. And unless we're going to posit the whole kind of consensual mass hallucination thing, then there has to be some kind of sense of an empirical, discernible meaning there. But by and large, we operate in the absence of such statements of intentionality, and indeed literary critics are warned, usually wisely, against any recourse to the tautology of authorial intentionality. Not only because meaning so often exceeds any discernible intentionality, when it even can be discerned, but because, of course, any claim to intentionality is so provisional and contingent and unreliable to begin with. And yet still the text seems to reveal patterns, systems of meaning, that some of us continue to think are worth exploring, even if we increasingly resist the idea of the symptomatic reading, in part because of the moral triumphalism inherent in that, the implicit sense that a stable truth can be revealed and that will always be ideological. Other modes have recently been proposed and they're inciting a lot of debate in critical circles right now, including surface reading and distance reading. And recent articles discussing such ideas use titles such as "The Turn Away from Marxism" or "Why We Read the Way We Read Now" and "Why We Argue About the Way We Read." These are two very recent articles. Are actually talking not about reading, but about interpretation. What is strikingly absent from most literary criticism, and why I decided to expose my ignorance in this way rather than talking about the stories I know best, is any consideration of how reading works, the psychology or cognition of reading itself. I completed a PhD in literature without anyone ever suggesting that I needed to ever think in any way at all about how reading works, how words transfer themselves from the page to my brain to something we call consciousness or understanding. I did reception theory, read-response theory, post-structuralist theory, and every other theory, but these are all attempts to describe not reading, again, but interpretation. Certainly no major theory in literary criticism that I'm aware of has ever engaged with the mechanics, the metaphysics of reading, the transference of meaning from a mark on the page to a thought in the head. How does this magical alchemical process work, and why don't literary critics ever think about it? We're like race car drivers who don't have the faintest understanding of mechanical engineering, even as we keep drawing new designs for cars. And this doesn't make us any less good at driving the car, even though we have no idea how it was made. And when I worked through that metaphor, I realized that what I really needed to do was go back to my original metaphor of the field. And it seems to me that we're like primitive farmers who know that sunlight makes plants grow, but we have no idea why. We can just predict that sunlight will make the plant grow, and we can build systems based on our certainty that sunlight will make the plant grow and that rain will, it's rain too. But we don't know what photosynthesis is, and we don't know how it works, and we don't have any biochemical formulas that allow us to describe that process or to understand why it works. We only know that it works. Now, I am here in the hope and expectation that you're going to explain photosynthesis to me, or at least show me how much further along we are than literary criticism thinks we are. But it seems to me really important that literary criticism, in my experience, almost never asks this question. Of course, literary criticism has recently been engaging with cognitive science, but at the moment, I think the state of play is at least in what cognitive science I've encountered, where it encounters literature, it seems to use cognitive science to merely describe in different terms what we can already observe. So it redescribes the fact that sunlight makes the plant grow without actually explaining why it works that way. So as I say, I'm hopeful that today I may learn more about how it works, or that maybe you'll tell me we still don't know. But maybe the feeling we're left with of a story that has intentions that operate beyond, above, behind, before, below, or in some other way prepositional to those of authorial agency, comes from text being symptomatic of certain qualities inherent in language and its relationship to meaning, as much as it models the human mind or consciousness, which I'm not sure that it does. So-called stream of consciousness, for example, which is the literary mode which is supposed to model human thinking, coined by William James, the American philosopher, and then pursued by Virginia Woolf and most famously James Joyce. That doesn't model any kind of consciousness that I recognize. It's an interesting literary experiment, but it's not how my thought processes work. Maybe it's how Joyce's, I always do that, how Joyce's thought processes works, and maybe that's what we learn. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. As I said, I've been reading The Turn of the Screw, which is by William James's brother, Henry, and I've been reading it for metaphors and ghostly meanings, for the apparitions of ideas that are conjured by words, and how words can both name and displace meaning. This is the basically Derridian idea that I said I would come back to, the ghost as supplement, the trace of meaning that is always deferred by language. But again, none of that actually gets at how those apparitions get into my head in the first place. The Turn of the Screw opens with what's called a frame narrative. House guests are telling stories around a fire, and one sets up the long story he is about to tell, and we are about to read. The guests begin to anticipate, to guess or second guess what they think the story will be about. The storyteller, who's called Douglas, turns out to be a big tease. He keeps dropping all these enigmatic hints while refusing to give very much away. And all of the guests think that what they're about to hear will be a love story. I see the narrator guesses she was in love. We've been told it's going to be narrated by a governess, or it's a story of a governess. I see the narrator guesses she was in love. Douglas says, "You are acute. Yes, she was in love. That is, she had been. That came out. She couldn't tell her story without its coming out." And there James is raising the ghost of intentionality. What happens when you tell a story and it brings out meanings that you don't intend for it to bring out? And the helplessness of that sense of revelation. She couldn't tell her story without its coming out. All of this is exchanged along with many significant speaking looks. James uses the word fix all the time in this story, by which he means like this deep fixing look, piercing look. And he says, "He continued to fix me. You'll easily judge," he repeated. "You will. I fixed him too. I see. She was in love." And so there's all of these kinds of enigmatic, cryptic exchanges that involve these speaking glances and speaking looks, and yet speech that doesn't say very much and implies a great deal. The idea that all of these guests think that The Turn of the Screw is going to be a love story might come as a surprise to many readers of The Turn of the Screw, who I suspect would not remember it as being anything of the kind. At this point of all of this back and forth, we have absolutely no idea what's going on. A female house guest called Mrs. Griffin speaks on behalf of James's readers everywhere and tells Douglas to please just cut to the chase. Stop being so coy and tell us whom the governess was in love with. Before Douglas can answer, the narrator butts in. So there's all this constant deferral, and the questions are never going to be answered. And the narrator butts in and tells Mrs. Griffin to hang on, which is a bit because he's been anticipating too. And he says, "The story will tell," he informs her. Wait for the story to reveal its meanings in due course, but again, this presumes that the story is where the intentionality resides. The story will tell, and it will reveal its meanings, as if the story has the authorial agency and has the consciousness. The story makes the utterance. It will tell. But then Douglas corrects him and issues a warning to all of James's readers. He says, "The story won't tell, not in any literal, vulgar way." Now, as it happens, I have loved this sentence for years because of what it does with language. It's certainly susceptible to Derridian deconstruction, the real deconstruction, not the kind that we're said to do to cheesecakes. The deconstruction in which the literal and the vulgar inevitably invoke the apparition of their binary opposites, which in this case would be the figurative and the refined. So, right, the opposite of the literal being figurative and the opposite of vulgar being refined. In the case of this sentence, though, you don't need Derrida to work out this meaning because the speaker has already negated the terms. He says it will not be literal and it will not be vulgar. So in order for us to just get the manifest meaning of that sentence, we must work out that what it will reveal then will only be in refined and figurative ways. And we have to infer that. And of course, the sentence itself is an injunction to inference. It will not tell in literal, vulgar ways. It will not tell you explicitly what its meanings are. So the injunction to the reader, the implied injunction to the reader is you must imply. You must get busy working out. You must infer, rather. You must get busy working out inferentially what the implications of the language that James uses are going to be. There are, of course, also class implications there in his idea that the literal is vulgar, which is beyond my scope today, and indeed would constitute the kind of symptomatic reading that we're trying to move beyond. So that kind of symptomatic reading, right, would just say that the word vulgar there is some kind of helpless revelation of James's own class positions, or possibly an intentional revelation of his own class positions, but that it's an ideological statement, and it surely is to a certain extent. But what does it mean to read between the lines? We can't do it literally, so that is itself a metaphor. How do we do it? There is no meaning between the lines, and yet all the implicit meaning is between the lines, and we read between the lines all the time. This is also known as interpretation. So how do we interpret this line? Well, I take what I know about the meanings of words and I spin out metonymical chains and their implications. And one of the things I've always told my students, which I'm starting now to question myself, is that the purpose of literary criticism is to take the implicit and make it explicit. I think that's true up to a point, but I think that might be why literary criticism doesn't work very well sometimes. The story won't tell, not in any literal, vulgar way, so it will only tell in figurative, refined ways. It will only tell its stories through figures. But James, writing The Turn of the Screw, turns the screw much further than this, because this is a ghost story. So in one sense, those figures who are telling the story and giving the meanings are literal. They are literal figures in the sense that they are ghostly figures. And of course, they're not literal at all because they're fictional ghostly figures, and they're ghosts, so they're not literal in that sense either. But it tells its story through the literalized figures of ghosts. Not only are those ghosts fictional, but they may be more fictional because they may be figures only in the governess's imagination. And it also tells the story through figurative language, through master tropes, including the idea of mastery itself, which by 1895 had for almost a decade been the nickname of the text author, as he well knew. It was so the idea that Henry James was the master was from about 1888. So it was almost a decade that he'd been known publicly as the master because of the lessons of the master. And he writes a story in which two of the main characters are known as the master. So they're all, and the theme of mastery is also central to the book. Who's in charge is something that he is thinking through. But also there are other master tropes: vision, perception, interpretation, evidence. These are all figurations, chains of figuration that James plays with. And one of the main questions that the text asks is how what we think we see determines what we think we know, and how what we think we know determines what we see. And it's that second turn, again, a turn of the screw, which James will always do, that is really, really important to the story, which is how much does, to put it crudely and to not do James's subtlety justice, but to what degree does cognitive bias control whatever we think our empirical sense of evidence might be. And this is all, as you can see, I'm struggling even for the language to articulate this, and you'll all have it to say, here's how you need to say this, Sarah, and that will help me a lot, which is part of the reason why I'm here. But they're incredibly interesting questions, obviously, and James is articulating them in 1898. And he does that through these twisting and spinning figures, through figurative chains of language, riffing on metaphors. And it's the way in which meaning is produced through metaphor that interests me the most, and that I want to try to think about in these my closing thoughts. Because as it happens, one of the words for metaphor, one of the master words for metaphor, trope, itself means turn. It's from the classical Latin tropus for figure of speech, which later meant chant, melody, phrase, sentence, or verse. It derives from the ancient Greek for turn, way, manner, particular mode, also more generally style or manner. But it also meant in Hellenistic Greek, and James certainly knew his Greek, a mode or mood of a syllogism, a method of instruction or explanation. The Turn of the Screw is a book about tropes, in a manner of speaking, for an author to whom a trope was more than just a figure of speech, which is all it is today. The word trope is always popping up in journalism, which makes me laugh all the time because it's just a figure of speech. The turn of the screw is the turn of the phrase, the turn of the trope itself, the turn of figuration. I said the Turn of the Screw is a symptomatic text, but what is it symptomatic of? Many people read it as a symptom of the governess's madness. Others read it as a symptom of James's or his moments, or the critic's moments, own ideological conflicts, particularly over sexuality and morality. Are the ghosts a symptom of the governess's repressed sexuality? Or is her repressed sexuality a symptom of James's repressed sexuality? Or is her repressed sexuality as a symptom of James's repressed sexuality a symptom of the readers having sexuality on the brain? Is James more in control than this? What is he mastering through the story? Or is the story or the reader mastering him? In different contexts, of course, it's read in different ways. Colm-Toibin in his novel The Master reads James as a melancholy, closeted homosexual, a portrait that has been very culturally influential over the last decade. But some would see this as a symptom of Toibin's own preoccupations, his own interest in the closet. Did James know his sexuality was repressed? Would this even be a meaningful statement to him? Had he repressed it so thoroughly that it could only find symptomatic expression in his writing? Or on the contrary, had he come to an accommodation with his own sexual desire that meant that his writing was symptomatic of other kinds of desire, like, for example, artistic, aesthetic, or linguistic mastery? What happens if Occam's razor determines meaning in the end, and the manifest content is no different from the latent content? What happens if a banana is just a banana and we can take things at face value? The changing frames of our own preoccupations change what we see in the text. We cannot read the turn of the screw today, I think, without seeing pedophilia and homosexuality everywhere. And of course, I'm not suggesting they're the same thing. They are both in the text. But there may be moments in the text that bring them together in ways that make readers today profoundly anxious, but also profoundly interested. Our problem is the same as the governess's problem. How do we know if what we think we see in figurative language is really there? How would we know it if it was really there? How do we read for involuntary, suppressed, inconsistent, or unconscious agency or meaning? Maybe what happens is not that, the post-structuralists have the famous dictum that it isn't the case that we speak language, but the case that language speaks us. But what happens is not that language speaks us in any totalizing sense, but that it drives our stories, and stories drive our cultures, following their own logics, their own affects. And that this is why intentionality and agency are insufficient to explain art. Theories of unconsciousness, phenomenology, quality, and the like are attempts to be objective about individual subjectivity, at least as I understand them. But what if it isn't about individual subjectivity, but properties inherent in language and story and context themselves? Now, I know this sounds like I'm just kind of fumbling toward linguistics, but my understanding of linguistics is that it doesn't, at least I've never seen it kind of move in these directions, but maybe you'll just tell me which books I need to read. Recent arguments in literary criticism over the so-called ethical turn and the so-called affective turn all return us to questions of human agency and subjectivity. Most, if not all, of our dominant literary theories for reading turn around author, reader, culture, and history. The human mind is the alpha and omega of the reading experience, and of course this must in certain irreducible ways be true. The words on the page have no meaning unless there's a mind taking them up. We know that. And equally it is true that language itself, as well as any given textual combination of it, are both human creations. But I keep thinking that language is a kind of Frankenstein's monster, that it has an agency that spins far out of the control of its creator. What if language is a kind of artificial intelligence that doesn't think because it doesn't have a mind, and it doesn't really have agency, it doesn't have volition, but it replicates some of the processes of thought in an almost autonomous way? Certainly metonymic or other kinds of figurative chains create a sort of chain reaction in language where authors detonate a metaphor and the explosion of meaning goes beyond their control. The reader who sees the symptoms of that explosion can trace those meanings back once the detonation has, as it were, stopped. Although, as Thomas Pynchon has brilliantly shown, and I don't know anybody who's better on the potential energy of metaphor than he is in The Crime of Lot 49, the energy of metaphor defeats even entropy, at least imaginatively. The possible meanings of a given figure are not infinite, but they are not necessarily subject to considerations of agency or intentionality either. I keep thinking that literature is not only symptomatic of the human mind or human history or human ideology, although it is symptomatic of all of those, but also symptomatic of the way that language works, and that our inability to understand that is reflected in our insistence on seeing only ethical or human questions in it, that this is symptomatic of our own self-referentiality. Literary critics often argue about what defines the literary. To me, what defines the literary, differentiating it from other kinds of textual productions, is metaphor. The literary is figurative, to my mind, and other kinds of texts aspire to ordinary language, to transparency. That kind of language seeks to be self-identical, whereas literary language finds ways to signify more. If ordinary language seeks transparency, literature, by contrast, aspires not to opacity, but to the ghostliness of figuration. I think I'll stop there.